Okay. I'll move around a little bit, but it's a tough time to talk about the economy, and I try to find some things to talk about that aren't just the standard gloom and doom. So I'm going to show you a few pictures today. Last time the economy felt this bad was probably 1982-83, and it's not clear that this may not get worse than that recession. In fact, in the last 5 months alone, we've lost about 2% of the number of jobs that the economy had at the peak of this expansion. In the 82-83 recession, it took 19 months to take out 3% of total employment. So you can see just in the last 5 months where we've lost over 400,000 jobs in September and October, over 500,000 jobs in November and December, and then just about 600,000 jobs in January. This thing has gathered a lot of momentum in just the last 5 months. The first 8 months of the year where we were technically in recession, we lost a half a percentage point of total employment in 8 months. Now it's been 2 percentage points in 5 months. So the economy's at a very delicate point right now where I think we are going to have to take some extraordinary measures to try to turn things around and stem the tide of job loss and get people focusing a little bit more positively on the future. And so it's at times like that that I think, you know, in the midst of all the bad news, you sort of want to look back and ask yourself, what were things like when we were in a similarly bad situation, and what happened in the wake of that, and how did we really get here? So I'm not going to talk so much about the last 5 months, because if you want to hear about that, just go home and turn on your TV or pick up the newspaper, because that's all they'll write about. I want to try to give you a little bit longer perspective on some things that aren't so bad about our economy, and in particular, I'm going to talk first about what happened when we emerged from the recession of 82-83. And I want to remind everyone that the whole decade of the 1970s and the early part of the 1980s was a terrible period for the U.S. economy. The S&P 500 index declined by 50% in real terms from 1970 to the trough of that 82-83 recession. That's a big decline in people's wealth positions. Furthermore, with all the job loss we had, I would also remind people that we were losing jobs in industries that we felt we sort of owned and were kind of the bedrock of our economy: autos, steel, other heavy manufacturing sectors. So we had job loss going on in those sectors, and I don't think we had any idea what would emerge to replace those jobs. Where would we be competitive? All we knew is we couldn't compete anymore with Germany and Japan. They were running us out of all these industries. They'd been anointed the next economic superpowers, and we were sort of written off for dead. Well, you fast forward about 20 years from that, in 2002, we could do no wrong. And people had stopped talking about Germany and Japan for about a decade by then. And nobody's talking about them being the next economic superpowers today. So I think it's important to remember that. There's a lot of dynamism in our economy. And actually coming out of this recession, I at least feel like I understand where our growth will come from. And it will come from the technology sectors that we built in the wake of that last severe downturn. Because what's happened over the last, 20, almost 25 years before this downturn set in, we had very strong real GDP growth, very strong underlying growth in productivity, relatively low unemployment rates for a long period of time, a robust stock market, and a rapid rise in the stock of wealth. And I'll show you some pictures that illustrate that. So this is just a picture of the unemployment rate, and you can see this is an early 1960s recession, the recession in the early 70s, 73, 74 oil shock, 1979, and then the big recession in 82-83 where unemployment spiked at nearly 11%. Since then, the cycles have been less pronounced, and unemployment rates at the peak of our recessions have been a lot lower. We'll see what happens this time. I won't be surprised if we touch 9% in the least, given the momentum that we see in job loss right now. This is a picture of the S&P 500 average since 1970. It's not adjusted for inflation, but remember, from 1970 till about 1982, in nominal terms, okay, so this is just the dollar values on an index, the S&P hardly went up at all. But over that period of time, we had inflation rates in a number of years that were pushing up around 10% a year. So the real value of stocks that you held for 12, 13 years went down by about 50%. What happened after we emerged from that recession? Well, you can see we had nice steady growth in the S&P, and then it really took off in the early 90s up through the dot-com bubble and bust, and then it reemerged again, and now it's crashed yet another time. But again, looking back in time, right, this index in 1982 was sitting at about 110 or 115, and today it's at 800. That's not so bad. Adjusting for inflation over that 25-year period, the S&P is still up 340% in real terms. Now, if you told people coming out of that recession in 82, 83, that the S&P 500 could go up 340% in real terms over the next 25 years, they would have taken that in a heartbeat, because I don't think anyone expected that to happen. So this is after the crash. We're still sitting there. Okay, it's not as good as it was a year ago, but let's not fail to take stock of that longer perspective. The other nice thing that happened over this period of time, this series is a little bit hard to make sense out of, but this is labor productivity, so it's output per hour worked in the private non-farm sector. It's very choppy. I'm not going to try to explain all the ups and downs. Labor productivity is very volatile, and it goes up and down with the business cycle. When output goes down a lot, as it is right now, productivity collapses because firms don't let go of workers as quickly as output falls. They wait for a while to make sure they really see a downturn in demand, and then they let workers go. And the same thing is true on the other side of the business cycle. When business picks up, it takes a while before firms decide we're really going to add additional staff to produce more output. So it's very choppy, but what you notice is that choppiness really stopped in about 1995. And for a long period of time, we had labor productivity growth every year, 2% or higher, sometimes up almost at 5%. And that's a remarkable achievement for growth in labor productivity in a really developed economy like ours, because we have to pretty much invent any improvement in technology. We're not just importing it from another country. So often you'll see high productivity growth in developing economies because they're importing best practices from around the world that have already been developed and implemented elsewhere. We've got to pretty much introduce our own innovation, and we've had a very good period in that regard since 1995.